Assalamu alaikum all. Welcome back to another episode of the Muslim Voice. Today we welcome Viqas Sheikh, former Vice President at Citibank, Senior Director at Thomson Reuters, and current Head of Business Insights at the London Stock Exchange, as well as a University of Essex graduate in accounting. So welcome, Viqas. How are you?
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum. Very good, thank you.
Great to have you. So to start off with, could you tell our viewers a little bit about yourself and how you are where you are today?
Sure. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. My name is Viqas Sheikh. I currently, as you said, head up Business Insights at the London Stock Exchange. I have been working in the area of finance for about 20 years now in London. I'm a qualified accountant and had experience, initially started off in investment banking, moved into information services, now at the London Stock Exchange in data and analytics.
Yeah. So looking back to all those years ago, when you were at the University of Essex, to where you are now at the London Stock Exchange, what are some of the key milestones in that journey for yourself?
So I think one of the things was being fairly clear on what you wanted to do as a career, right? And I think how my journey has gone is not how I would advise. How I advise sort of younger brothers and sisters today, because I was sort of winging it, as I say. My reason to want to become an accountant was a bit odd. I had a cousin who was extremely rich. I didn't know what he did. I said, "What does he do?" "He's an accountant." "Okay, I want to do that," even though I didn't know what it was. So the reason for it was simply that I followed that through. Since the age of 12, I did my GCSEs and A-levels in commerce and accounting. Went to University of Essex. Did accounting, and then sort of you sort of find your way, because you didn't really have what you have now, which is people to advise you, to guide you in terms of what the career entails, if it's a useful career, in terms of not just earning money, but a wider purpose. But yeah, I think obviously graduating, alhamdulillah, well, and then stumbling into banking. I never really wanted to go into banking, but it was a misunderstanding through which I got into banking. But I think realizing almost like putting tactical and strategic goals in place. What are my short-term goals now that I'm here versus what are my longer-term goals has sort of helped me navigate that journey to date, alhamdulillah, and helped me get myself outside of banking after having fallen into it, and also I guess allowed me to realize trying to sort of realize the bigger purpose of what we do as a career now.
And obviously, since you graduated, has there been moments where your faith helped to guide you through the challenges of your early days in corporate working?
So I think your faith guides you throughout, right? And your faith, whether it's at uni, whether it's in the workplace, isn't something you can just leave at the door, and Allah doesn't give us that option, neither should we think of it as an option. So your deen is something that you hold strong to. Obviously, as you go into these environments, there are sort of tailwinds that you're going to, or headwinds I should say, that you're going to get, which make it difficult at times, but then that's where you have to sort of anchor yourself to something which makes sure that you don't go beyond a sort of circle of permitted movement, if you like, right? You draw your boundaries and you stick to those boundaries, and you don't see stepping outside those boundaries as a choice, right? That's why you have to, I think, as I said, understand your bigger purpose as a Muslim in life, and also connect yourself to the right avenues and the right people to make sure that you are putting your faith front and center, your Islam front and center in these places, and you're visible as a Muslim as well, so that it makes it easier for you to navigate those challenges and those contradictory practices in workplaces and universities as they come along.
Absolutely. And yeah, that kind of segues perfectly, because while at Reuters, Citibank, or currently at the London Stock Exchange, have you faced situations, obviously feel free to be specific,
yeah,
situations where these Islamic values that you mentioned were challenged directly, and if so, how did you navigate that?
So I think with me directly, yes, there's a couple of examples, but because at Citigroup, where I was before, I used to head up the Muslim network here at the London Stock Exchange, and previously at Thomson Reuters, I head up the Muslim network, Global Muslim Employees Network, and Multi-Faith Network. So I get to hear about other people's experiences as well, the Muslims' experiences. And yeah, there are lots of situations where people will either face discrimination. It's either conscious or unconscious bias, because a lot of the times people don't know they're saying something offensive to you. They just think it's just a joke, or it's something they may have read in the media, and they think it's perfectly normal to say. But our job is to use the mechanism and the system created by these organizations, right? Because we live in a far more aware environment now, whether it's at university, whether it's in the workplace. All companies have an equity, diversity and inclusion agenda. They have frameworks in place, they have principles around this. So you've got to use those same principles to hold that company to account if you're facing discrimination on the basis of your faith, of the faith of Islam, etc. And yeah, then that's exactly what we've got better at doing over time. Yeah. I wouldn't say we were doing it from the beginning, but in workplaces you will find that I always push myself and others as well in other companies to use those same systems to ensure that people recognize that it's not okay to discriminate on the basis of faith or anymore, obviously of race, faith, etc. And yeah, so we have to make sure that we are aware of what those principles, what those sort of systems are, and make sure that we're using them.
Absolutely. And moving away from Islamic values for a second, could you tell us a bit just about your role at the London Stock Exchange? Because obviously, just on paper, that can be kind of daunting for people,
All right.
Like obviously the London Stock Exchange. So what do you actually do there?
So I think, the London Stock Exchange, when you say London Stock Exchange, people immediately think of like these traders screaming at screens and sort of got phones to their ears. I think, all of those classic sort of Wolf of Wall Street movies and all of that sort of stuff, right? But no, the London Stock Exchange actually, as a business, the stock exchange part of it is actually quite small. It, I think, contributes about 10 to 15% of the revenue. The large part of what we do is we sell data and data platforms, which is about 75% of what the London Stock Exchange does. What my unit in Business Insights do is, if the easiest way to describe us is like we are the smartwatch of the company. So what we do is, while the company is busy selling data and analytics and insights to other companies so that they can have a look at what's happening inside their shop, what my organization does is it helps the London Stock Exchange to look internally at what we're doing, what our strategic goals are, what our objectives are, what our key performance metrics are, and then how we're trending and performing against those, where we're doing well, where we need to course correct. So we set all of that up with every level of leadership, from the executive committee down all the way to individual business units, to understand what their strategic goals are, and then help them measure against those as they progress through the course of the year, so that they know where they're doing well and where they need to change direction.
And again, on paper, what you just said there doesn't sound like a traditionally like a religiously accepting industry, right? So has that changed in your experience over time, or how have you found that to be?
In terms of the London Stock Exchange being religiously?
In terms of, so just kind of the industry in general, obviously finance, and obviously, obviously from the outside looking in, it doesn't always seem the most...
that's right. So it's finance. As I said, I've spent about 20 years in finance now, right? I can categorically say that conventional finance for a Muslim is can be a very murky space to be, right? And that's why you have to be very aware as you tread very softly in what you eventually are going to do if you choose a career in finance, right? I started off in, as I said, investment banking, fell into it by mistake, wealth management, but very quickly, very early in my career, realized that this was problematic from a Sharia perspective. I was, selling products, and I was, alhamdulillah, I was very good at it. From that perspective, at least from the I guess the metrics, etc., would say, but it just was very uncomfortable, because what are you selling? And you're making lots of money, but what you're actually selling is something which is impermissible. So I pushed myself away from those direct jobs roles that were dealing with the riba, into middle office and back office and outside of that. and made that journey into what is now information services. So what we do now is we buy and sell data, right? Which is a little bit different to dealing in the riba directly, etc. So I guess in a nutshell, what I would say is that this is where I was saying you have to keep yourself connected to people of knowledge if you're deciding for a career in finance. And you have to make sure that you're not just looking at the prize. I speak to a lot of graduates, a lot of guys at different universities, young boys and girls who are graduating. Almost invariably, the career of choice is investment banking. Why is that? It's because it pays the most, straight up. There's not that much consideration given to, is it actually permissible, right? So the first question we should be asking ourselves isn't how much is this going to pay me, is this, can I actually do this from a Sharia perspective? Because honestly, the weight that bears down your back around how you are earning your money is huge, right? And I can tell you that from my own personal experience. When I was working in frontline banking, even when I used to get a promotion, alhamdulillah, when I was at Citi for 11 years, I got promoted 5 times. And every time I got that promotion and the pay rise, I would say, alhamdulillah, then I think to myself, should I be here? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and there was this constant contradiction in my head. And so, alhamdulillah, I was most generous. You're connected to scholars, connected to a lot of students of knowledge who know far more than I do, alhamdulillah. And I was able to navigate through that with their help. And I hope get to a much better place, right? But you can't sort of just blindly keep following that path. You have to make an educated decision around working in finance and banking. And I guess a little segue onto that is, then sometimes you get that question, well, if nobody goes into that area, how are you ever going to know what it entails to then give an alternative, right? And that's a fair question, right? I think the answer to that I usually give is if you are going to go into that area, go with a very clear plan and make sure you are anchored with the right people who are going to make sure that you don't keep falling down that slippery slope of earning lots of money. Because obviously that's what happens is when you go into these institutions, even if you go with the intention of learning the trade and coming out and putting something together, which is a noble intention, once you start seeing the money, your lifestyle starts changing. And then you've got that car to pay for, then you've got that payment to make here and there and whatever else it is. And so when you get to that 3-year plan, when I was supposed to jump out, I'm too tied in to this, right? And then all of a sudden you've got that promotion staring at you as well. So you've got to make a choice. I was only here to learn about it and get out, but I'm getting this much more money, I'm getting that promotion, I've got to make all these payments, I'm now married, for example. Yeah. So the choices become very, very difficult. So if you've got that noble intention of learning and jumping out, have a very solid plan around it. Don't be somebody who's just intending to do that for yourself and then, so it's very, very important that you...
So as you spoke there, you fell into investment banking almost by accident. So did you find the decision to leave particularly difficult or...
No, I think the way Allah made it, so honestly, wallahi, I'm not saying this, the way Allah set it all up was that when I left after 11 years, I had zero fear of the fact that I was leaving with nothing in hand. I actually pushed for my redundancy, right? And somebody will say, well, 11 years it took you. It did, but it wasn't because through the lack of trying. What I was trying to do in that time was move myself far enough away from the conventional banking work into fungible work that the bank also did around operations and continuous improvement that would take me into other industries. Because otherwise it's only banks that are going to take you for your banking expertise. But there are other areas within banking where you can obviously train yourself that can be used in other industries. Now, so that's what I sort of upskilled myself in and then jumped out into industry, which was disconnected work to banking, right? Now, I guess what was the original question that you sort of said?
So in terms of like you said, it can be difficult once you're in investment banking, once you're in something that's impermissible. Once you start seeing all the the worldly benefits, it's hard to jump out. So how was that for yourself in terms of?
Oh yes, the decision you said was so the decision was very easy. And to be honest with you, when I left as well, there were the majority of offers I was getting after 11 years in banking were from big banks, right, and ex-bosses, because this is how it works. Is a lot of the time it's the connections that you've made that are going to get you jobs, and they came back with offers and all the rest of it. But it just wasn't, for me, it wasn't an option, right? I don't, you don't walk into a supermarket and look at a product which is attractive but not halal and think, hey, I'll just buy that because it's, it was no longer an option for me, if that makes sense. So I sort of held out. And, this is why, there's a saying that never will you leave something for the sake of Allah, except that He will replace it with something much better, right? This isn't a theory, this is a fact. And that's exactly what, alhamdulillah, transpired. Something came my way, which was wasn't in banking and is much better. And I can say 9 years down the line, because it's been 9 years now at the London Stock Exchange in various forms, that it was, alhamdulillah, the best decision that there could be.
And what was that role initially? So when you took the lead, what was the first role?
So the first role was heading up their incentive compensation strategy and schemes. So this is how much is the business making versus how much are we paying the sellers who are selling it, right? Because both of those things need to be connected in a healthy way to make sure that we are making money in a sustainable and positive way. Yeah. So that's what that role was initially, and then there was a big merger between part of Thomson Reuters and the London Stock Exchange. So I was heading up that merger between Refinitiv and London Stock Exchange, and then I moved into the role that I am in now. So.
And obviously, in your various roles, what lessons in leadership have you learned, and how can young Muslims develop these kind of leadership skills that you've experienced?
So I think. Lessons in leadership, really, and I know this is going to sound like a soundbite. I honestly say this every time. We have a number of conferences, leadership conferences that we're sent to, and they tell us about new leadership, modern leadership strategies, etc. Every time I'm listening to the things they're saying, it just goes back to the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Honestly, I would genuinely encourage, if you're looking to learn about leadership, read the seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in terms of having a strategy, in terms of having a goal, in terms of selling a vision, in terms of how you treat people, in terms of making sure you get outcomes. All of these things are covered in the seerah in a way that are now being taught in modern leadership theory, right? So, honestly, I would say, alhamdulillah, over many years, and even now, I've led large teams in different locations, right? And different locations mean people who are of a different culture. Right, so you're not going to all get sort of, yes, we've grown up in the UK, but culture in Asia, culture in the US, it's very different. The way people think, the way you have to motivate them. But you've got that common thread of how you lead people through the lens of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad in terms of, like I said, giving people respect, making sure they know their value in what you're doing, making sure they understand the bigger purpose of what you're trying to achieve. And when you making sure that you have a relationship that you can, where you are approachable and respectful, but also you're able to admonish where you need to admonish, and that admonishment gets listened to, right? Because there's a fine balance there. You can either have the iron fist and be an alpha male or an alpha female, I guess these days, whatever you want to call it, or you can be too approachable so that you haven't got the clout and gravitas where you need it. You have to have that relationship where you are someone who is a person of trust, but equally at the same time when you need to give that sort of the feedback and it needs to be taken on board, it is. So as I said, alhamdulillah, I had quite decent success with that because we have 360 surveys that are done every year, and alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah, I've never not been happy with the scores that we've got there. But that I put always, and I always ascribe it as well. I tell the people in my teams when we give them a pay rise when they haven't asked for it, when we give them, we treat them with respect, when, I stand up to my sort of like their heads for them, and they recognize that, I always attribute it back to my deen. I always do, because you have to in your, I think as a professional Muslim, there is absolutely no reason why you shouldn't attribute all of these things back to your deen. We don't live in an era anymore where we have to hide our deen. It should be front and center. You should be wearing it, on your chest as you go walk into those professional environments.
Yeah, absolutely. And you spoke a bit about diversity there. So, whilst in the corporate world, obviously we know, you can be faced with a lot of issues or agendas that don't directly align with your values. So how do you deal with those?
So So there's two things here, right? Talking about diversity very quickly, and I'll take one by one. One is diversity as a framework that all companies want to show themselves as being inclusive, to make employees comfortable and ensure that they're being fair. It's, like I said, it's called EDI, usually equity, diversity, and inclusion, right? So all companies they have an agenda, they have a strategy and all the rest of it. But the second side of it is not just a strategy through an sort of like a greater good altruistic intention. There's what you call an inclusion dividend, which is very well known now, that they will make more money the more inclusive they are. Yeah. There's a very good book called The Inclusion Dividend, written by Mark Kaplan, which goes through why companies make more money if they're more inclusive, right? So they have an inherent reason to be more inclusive. It's not just because they want to be, if that makes sense, right? And the other thing is, in the course of that inclusion, what you have to do is you have to understand what the purpose, take it down to base principles. Why is EDI in place? If you ask what EDI is there to do, it is there to ensure that the interests and the values of minority, those with minority characteristics are protected, right? And that includes Muslims, that includes black people, women, and so on and so forth, all the rest of it. Now, sometimes where you have a conflict in the workplace, for example, like you said, some of the common things, let's speak about some of the common things which are more difficult that people find to navigate. Work drinks, very common in the city. Yeah. Everybody's going for drinks. Or Christmas parties, right? Or participating in an event which is, let's say, run by the LGBTQ society, or supporting it because you're a part of the network. These are very common things I see and I hear about. The way that we navigate these are simply by saying that as Muslims, we have certain values that EDI is here to protect. Now, in order for us to participate in any of these things, you're asking us to compromise those very values which you had set EDI to protect, right? So, in the first instance, you shouldn't be asking us to participate in this, because through your EDI agenda, that's what it's there for, right? And so to allow yourself to exclude is a part of inclusion, if that makes sense, right? Absolutely. Why? Because if you are allowing and understanding that there are certain individuals on the basis of their values, they're going to exclude themselves from certain things that are done in the workplace, that's actually being an inclusive employer. So this is why I'm saying it's very, very important to understand the framework and then use that framework properly. And I think that the reason why, I actually will say this very boldly, like without any hesitation, the reason why a lot of us have to make compromises in our workplaces now is because we are probably not brave enough to challenge these things. If you were to challenge them using those frameworks, you would realize that the company would come to your level and understand. Getting a prayer space, getting halal food, and all of this I see as absolute basics now. I don't mean to sound too flippant, but these shouldn't be, we need to get past this point now. This should be standard, because we're not living in the era of when our parents became, for example, professionals, or even when we became professionals. There was no Diversity and Inclusion Act of 2010. Everybody wasn't scrambling to be seen as the most inclusive employer. As I said, we live in a different environment now. So we need to make sure that we're using those tools correctly, and getting what we, making sure that our voices are being heard as Muslims, and that the company is accommodating that. And I'm saying that beyond the basics of halal food and prayer spaces. I'm talking about strategic things, right? We've challenged our company's policies on giving to religious charities. We've challenged our company's policy on their communication and support in the war in Gaza. Right? And we've taken it to the very top. Why? Because we've used that same framework that they had put in place to challenge them around their behavior. This is what your framework is, this is what your principles are, and this is how you're behaving. How does that reconcile? And how can they not accept it if it doesn't reconcile? So it's up to us to hold them to account, basically, is what I'm saying, and not be afraid. And I could give you we haven't got time. I'll give you so many examples of what I've seen is where we have compromised as Muslims versus getting on that front foot and making sure that the company accommodates what our values are. And it's very sad to see.
Yeah. I mean, you can give a couple examples of times where Muslim employers haven't been bold enough, like you said, to challenge.
So there's plenty of. I'll give you an example of one particular example. In one company that I used to work, there was. I don't know. It was always going to come. It always had to come to a sister and this, that, the other. But there was a sister who used to work in a very sort of front office sales part of the business.
Yeah.
And mashallah tabaraka, it was refreshing to see. She used to wear an abaya and a hijab and everything, and she used to be very active in the Muslim network as well. And then all of a sudden she vanished for a while, and then one day after a month, 2 months, I sort of bumped into somebody. And I thought they looked familiar, but they were obviously this person wasn't wearing a hijab. They weren't even wearing the clothes that were fully, by no means covering the awra even, right, not even the part, in terms of. And I couldn't. Then I realised who it was, and it was that sister, right? And I remember I couldn't, and I was quite shocked. And then, anyway, long story short, I then asked her for a meeting. We met because we used to, as I said, she's involved with the network and stuff. And in the course of that conversation, I asked her. I said, I'm just going to ask you straight up, what happened? You used to be a hijab, but it was really refreshing to see, and all the rest of that. And all of a sudden, you decided to change. And she said, I just realized, she said, I was working in the front office, I was going for drinks every day, I was seeing clients every day, I was shaking hands with men and stuff, and then I had the abaya and a hijab on. And I just thought these two things don't go together, and so I had to make a choice. She goes, so obviously, I made that choice effectively, which was to sort of conform. Yeah. And I thought, what a tragic, what a sad decision to make. It was really very sad at that point in time because, as I say, as a consequence of doing that, who have you pleased, which is the people around you, and who have you displeased? Yeah. And is that even worth doing?
Exactly.
So that was just one example. And we've got very good examples of the other side where young graduates who come in, who are encouraged to go to drinks parties and told their careers are going to be impacted by that. But they don't. They come to the likes of me or us now who are more senior Muslims and ask for the advice, and it's up to us, and this is a little segue for any senior Muslims or Muslims in the city who are, it's our responsibility to create that environment that we don't leave the grads hung out to dry, because we have to make sure that we are challenging the system enough so that they're not being pressurized into going to drinks or Christmas parties or this, that, the other, or if they're even very recently somebody who isn't comfortable, and I fully respect, shaking hands with the opposite sex. It's for us to be able to vocalize that at the right level so that they're not sort of left out on their own. But a lot of the time, senior Muslims, and we're getting better at this, but there's a lot of individualism as well. A lot of concern as how it's going to impact my career if I come out and say these things. You've got to get outside of that comfort zone. As a senior Muslim, it's your responsibility. You can't see it as an option to create those environments. But nevertheless, I guess this is again there's an entire ecosystem that needs to be created here of senior Muslims who are doing that, grads who are holding on to their values, and lots more that needs to be in play here. But nonetheless, in your silos, you've got to stick to those things. Yeah. Because as I said, honestly, your companies will, as you go into the workplace, you'll realize your companies are more accommodating. And the last thing I'll say on that, even in your interview process, even as you're interviewing companies, ask them questions like, do you have a prayer space? Do you have a Muslim network? Our HR person came and told us that she interviewed somebody who refused a coffee, and he said he was fasting. And so she also stopped having the coffee. She also didn't order one, and they actually made it a part in their HR process to, if they're interviewing in Ramadan, don't go to a place where you go for a coffee or something. And similarly, we've had other examples in a similar vein where faith has been accommodated. Why? Because people have asked about these things, right? People have said it's a big deal to me. I mean, I've got to come and pray 5 times a day or 3 these days. At least 4 times a day in the workplace. And where these companies understand the inclusion dividend, they're going to want to accommodate it. So don't do yourself an injustice by not asking these questions.
So you'd absolutely encourage,
100%
to always ask.
100%. And don't think you're going to be at a disadvantage as a consequence of that. It's as I said, we have to be on the front foot with these things.
And obviously, like you said there, with EDI and companies, in the modern age, they're becoming more inclusive and more welcoming of Muslims. But obviously, it's not perfect, and it never will be. So have you experienced any kind of bias or Islamophobia in your professional life? And if you have, which I think is the most important thing when talking about this, is how did you respond?
Right.
And did it make you kind of more resilient? Or
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. I mean, there's two ways in which that can happen. One way is where it's intentional. One way is, as I said, where it's just unconsciously somebody. So there was somebody I got on really well with when I was at Citigroup, and it was a director. We used to have a lot of deep conversation because this was in the thick of the London Bridge bombing and this and that, all of those things that the right-wing media obviously it's a hotspot for Muslims, right, in the UK. And we used to have some deep conversations. I remember him asking me once. He said, "All right, I'm going to ask you a question straight up." And seriously, he goes, and this is non-Muslim by the way. Obviously, he goes, "If one of your brothers was going to bomb a site, let's say a bridge or a club," he goes, would you tell the authorities?" He goes, "Honestly, would you tell the authorities?" Like that, right? I looked at his face and I said, "Listen," I said, "I'm going to let you off for this one." Even though he's like, he was a couple of grades senior than me at the time. He was a managing director. I was only a VP then. And I go, I'm honestly going to let you off for this one because of ignorance. But if anybody else had said this to me, I would have gone straight to HR and make sure they were dealt with, right? And he really sort of like got on the defensive and after that. But again, it comes back to making sure that you don't let people get away with these things. And it sometimes sounds easy because maybe I was in that position where I had the leverage to do that. Not everybody has the leverage to do that. What's the grad? What if somebody's? I mean, this is my own example. I can give you countless examples of people who have, on the basis of Islam, on the basis of their hijab, there's been mikh that's taken out of them, or people, "Oh, you're going to go and pray now, and you're going to fast, and you think the God's going to take you into heaven," that sort of stuff. Sort of like taking the
making light.
Exactly, making light of it, because obviously we live in an enlightened era where religion is something which is archaic and of the past, right? Yeah. And what does religion have to do with the workplace, especially, right? So it seems, and that's where we, as I said, number one, if you've got the leverage, you don't let them get away with it. But number two is you have to create environments in these organizations where you have an automatic system through which you can challenge as well. So you have to get the Muslim network, and not Muslim networks, with all due respect these days, that are too busy doing networking events and dinners and fast-a-thons and this and that. No, the true purpose of a Muslim network is to hold that company to an account and make change for Muslims in that organization. It's going to last way beyond them. Yeah. And make sure that those, that the Muslims are being looked after, make sure that the policies and procedures of that organization have protections for Muslims embedded within them, right? That's the role of a Muslim network, and make sure where there is any discrimination against any Muslims of any sort, that is amplified and dealt with in a way that it won't happen again. I can tell you this, any other minority group, when you're talking about, you're sitting around a table, and I give this as an example often, and I will give it just to give you an idea. I was sitting around a table when I was at Thomson Reuters, head of the Muslim network, and we used to have a quarterly round table, and we used to discuss what your achievements have been for this quarter. And I remember that year we had managed to get halal food, and we had got a prayer room. And the head of D&I, she was sitting there and she said, "Okay, what were your achievements?" And I said, we've managed to get halal food. There's 2 options of halal food in the canteen. We've got a prayer space, and we're like, subhanAllah, we're really like happy, proud of what we've done. Went around the table and we got to the Jewish network. Okay, what have you guys done? And he goes, "Yeah, we've done another round of," I can't remember what the exact term was, but basically young and old connecting. What that meant was that every Jewish youth that came into the organization, they would connect them to a board member on Wall Street as a mentor. Yeah, and he goes, "We've had our 6th round of that successfully this time. X amount of young Jews have come to the organization. They've been connected to X amount to create longevity and to make sure that the chain remains." And I remember listening to that, and I was like, subhanAllah, we're sort of high-fiving over chicken drumsticks here, halal chicken drumsticks, and these guys are thinking on another level, yeah? And they would hold the organization to account to make sure that they fund things that were going to help that as well. If anything was out of line, they would make sure, they would hold the organization's feet to a fire in a way that they're not going to misstep again. we almost ask apologetically as Muslims, can we have a prayer room? Can we have one, there's a dish that's halal, please,
Is that an issue of mindset, do you think?
It is an issue of mindset. It's an issue of like a sort of like an inferior mentality that we need to, and this is why I'm saying you have to become more brave. You have to ask these questions, because how can an organization, let the organization counter it, let them do that, and then come back with a response, because ultimately the answer can't really be anything else apart from, we need to probably give you these things. We need to accommodate this, because even if it's one Muslim, and I had this conversation because I advise a number of companies on setting up their Muslim network. I've been advising a company which is quite near us recently. I said, even if it's 2 or 3 Muslims, it doesn't make a difference. You need that facility. You need to pray. Ask the question. Don't be afraid to ask these questions. And you've got to change that mentality coming out of uni, going into these workplaces. I know that it's daunting because you're thinking, oh, am I even going to get a job? Oh, there's too much at risk here, because if I ask the wrong questions, am I going to be filtered out and somebody in? You've got to be brave about this stuff. Don't start on the wrong foot. Don't start on the wrong foot, because whenever you start something with Allah front and center in mind, Allah is going to put barakah in there, for sure. Absolutely. There's no two ways about it.
And looking towards the future, obviously you're in the heart of corporate London. So looking to the future, do you think that it's becoming more of an environment where Muslims feel comfortable to ask these things, or how would you say, what do you say the future looks like for Muslims in the workplace?
So I think the future, in many ways, is up to the Muslims. Really is. And I don't mean to. What I would say is, let me strip it back. The corporate environments that we work in now, in terms of awareness and inclusivity and acceptance, are completely different to even 15 years ago, right? The foundations are laid for various minority groups of all sorts to come in and thrive. Whether this is genuine or however, this is a wave that we need to ride, right? Forget about does not. It's a wave that we need to ride. So it's up to us to now make sure, as I said from before, that we are riding that wave. The environment is there. Companies have the agendas to accommodate. We need to make sure that we are asking the right questions and making sure that our needs are met from a tactical, which is your salah and your prayer room and your food and your this and that perspective, Ramadan allowances, and strategic stuff as well. Have you got quotas for Muslims in the workplace? Do you let how many Muslims did you get in who did internships? At London Stock Exchange, I take 2 Muslims every year from lower social mobility backgrounds into the work. I've got to deal with them to do that. And hold them to account for these things. How much of your CSR agenda focuses on, Muslim causes, for example, or all of these things? How much charity we give as Muslims? What have your responses been, as we said, to the conflicts around the world? How did you respond to Ukraine and Russia versus how you're responding to Gaza and the way that the genocide is happening over there? These are things that we have to make sure that we're asking and getting answers for, because the environment is there to do that. We're no longer in an environment where if somebody fires you for asking that question, honestly, you'll be rich enough to live your life without working again, because the law protects you from these things now, right? So be brave, be on the front foot. Literally, honestly, our time is gone. Not being funny, right? You guys are stepping into this space, and if you're not going to make the change, then who is? Right? It's our responsibility to create that environment that you can come in and be comfortable in, and then take it to the next level. And I think we've had good success with that. Some because of our own efforts as Muslim networks, some because, like I said, companies have woken up to the fact that they need to accommodate Muslims. But now, it's the job is of the next set of people coming in to take the baton and run with it even further. And I honestly, I don't say that lightly. I genuinely feel that we have the right opportunity to really embed the next level of how Muslims are perceived and how their rights are sort of protected in the corporate environments, and it's up to us to be able to actualize that.
Absolutely. And moving back to you personally for a moment, are there any specific habits or routines that you've had throughout your
Yeah.
corporate life that have helped you, that helped you get to where you are today?
Yeah, alhamdulillah. I think, first and foremost, I really would encourage everybody, number one, to, I say this to a lot of the youngsters, why is it that you want to do what you want to do, right? So knowing what your purpose is, and your purpose is much more than that paycheck that comes through your account every month, right? Why, if Allah has given you a skill set, what was the real reason for that, So knowing why you're there, really invest time into trying to understand what the purpose is of why I'm here. We've spoken about risk and it's written, right? There's a statement of Hassan al-Basri, rahimahullah, and he said that I read Allah promising your risk 80 times in the Quran, and I read the shaitan threatening you with poverty only once, But we're so scared about how we're going to earn that we forget everything else. Your risk is written, right? These jobs are only excuses for it to come to you, right? So think about, why am I here? Connect with really, really good people, with scholars, with brothers who keep your head in the right place. Because, the corporate environment, I can tell you this from my experience of knowing people and even my own experience. When people start, when you start getting higher and higher up that ladder, you get this false sense of, not achievement is the wrong word, but self-worth, right? And you need people to bring you back down to earth. And you need to make sure that you're connected to people who always make you realize how you are supposed to navigate this space. So I think I was very fortunate, alhamdulillah, to be connected to those people, even in and around me immediately, but also with scholars who we studied with as well, who would always make sure that you've got a purpose in mind. Make sure that you measure, and I do this for a living, right? So make sure that you know what you're trying to achieve, and then you see what you've done against it, whether it's in your workplace, right? When do you want that next promotion? Why do you want it, in terms of what you need to do to get there? Be very clear, have clear goals, right? You have to have clear goals, because I know that sounds obvious, but I promise you, Eamon, you will see, even at a corporate level, organizations don't have clear goals, right? So individually, you need to have your clear goals clear. They need to be measurable, even with your Quran and your tarbiyah as well. How much am I going to study and how much I'm going to memorize over the next year? What did I do against that? Did I meet that? Did I not meet that? It's very simple. It has to be something that you measure, and I make sure that at least I have something memorialized, written down, which sort of gives you an idea of what you're trying to achieve, and make sure that you can track against it as you go along. So I think that's really important. Connecting yourself to the right people, knowing what your higher purpose is, making sure that you're sitting at a table where you're not the most clever person. You know that saying that if you're sitting at a table where you're the cleverest person, you're sitting at the wrong table. Alhamdulillah, I feel all my life I've sat at the right table, because I've never been the most clever one sitting at a table, alhamdulillah. So make sure that you're connecting yourself to the right people, the right purpose, and then executing that by really measuring how you're doing against that tangibly.
I mean, you've given a whole heap of advice there, but to finish off, I was going to ask, what's one piece of advice that you'd give to young Muslims and Muslim students, across the UK?
So number one, I think, really think about the higher purpose of why you're studying, what you want to do with life. Before, as I said, before you know it, there should be more than just earning a living connected to it. Allah's given you a set of skills. Allah's put you in a position where you're going into a career. What's the real purpose behind that? Do I use any of the skills for His sake, or am I just going to earn my living, etc. Number two, as I said, as you enter the corporate environment, if that's where the direction you're going to go in, then absolutely be brave. And make sure that you are connecting yourselves to people who are in the system already, who are going to help you and leverage you. When I was growing up, frankly, and I was at the stage where you guys are, we didn't really have professional Muslims, good professional Muslims, the head screwed on, I should say, who you could really go and talk to, who had time for you. Now you do, even if it's on LinkedIn, even if it's through a talk that you've sort of, or I don't know, whatever podcast you've seen talk, reach out to people, and honestly, they will make time for you. The one thing I will say though, and because I know a lot of professional senior Muslims to whom people reach out to, what is a little bit frustrating is if you're giving someone your time and you're not seeing any outcome. So what happens is when you reach out, they'll probably give you pointers, do this, but you're not really seeing anything happen. make sure if somebody's giving you their time, and I can promise you it's difficult to give time, right? When you get to a certain level, then utilize that time and show change in a response to that, right? Make sure that you're using the advice that you're being given and showing outcomes against that. And honestly, they'll keep you in mind. They'll keep you in mind for things that come up, because you're a proactive person. Always be proactive is one of those things as well. I think you have to bear in mind.
Thank you, Viqas.
Jazakallah
Thank
khair.
you for coming on.
Good to speak to
Great
you.
to have you.
Likewise.
So Viqas Sheikh, that's all for the Muslim Voice today. Thank you for listening. Jazakallah khair. Look out on our Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and of course Spotify for this episode we posted at the Muslim Voice Pod on TikTok and Instagram. Thank you again to Viqas Sheikh for joining us today. And yeah, stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum.